Open them up for me. Until the Korean Mafia boss couldn't stop asking for more from his black secretary. The fluorescent lights of KMJ Holdings' executive floor hum softly at 11:47 p.m., casting cold shadows across a desk that costs more than most people's yearly salary. Amara's fingers freeze above her keyboard, her vision blurring as exhaustion slowly creeps in. The coffee beside her has gone cold hours ago. Her sensible heels sit abandoned beneath the desk, her arches aching from another 16-hour day. She blinks once, twice. The document comes into focus. Shell accounts, routing numbers that don't match, trade agreements for shipments that don't exist. This is not just business. This has never been just business. Panic doesn't rise. She's too professional for that. But awareness does, sharp and cold. She's been translating, organizing, documenting things that could get people killed. Things that have gotten people killed. Her heart hammers against her ribs as fragmented pieces of the last 3 months try to assemble themselves into something coherent. The pristine contracts hiding dirty money. The polite men in expensive suits who bow too deeply. The way entire rooms adjust their breathing when he enters. You see it now. The voice is quiet, controlled, and dangerously close. Amara's head snaps up. There, standing in the doorway of his private office with an expression that can only be described as dangerously satisfied, stands Chairman Kang Min-jun. Even at midnight, even in the dim office lighting that makes most people look exhausted, he looks like power personified. His black suit is still perfectly pressed despite the late hour, not a thread out of place. His dark eyes, so dark they appear almost black, watch her with an intensity that suggests he's been standing there for some time. His face is all sharp angles and controlled emotion, the kind of face that gives nothing away until it's too late. His hands rest casually in his pockets, but there's nothing casual about the way he's studying her. Sir, Amara manages, her voice steadier than she feels. I was just finishing the quarterly. You were just realizing, Min-jun interrupts smoothly, stepping into the light, that you haven't been working for a legitimate corporation. Her throat tightens. I don't lie. He moves closer, each step measured and deliberate. You're too intelligent for that. It's why I hired you. The room feels smaller suddenly, more dangerous. You knew I would figure it out, she says slowly, the pieces clicking together with horrifying clarity. Min-jun's lips curve into something that isn't quite a smile. I was counting on it. Her mind races. She's been in Seoul for 3 months, running from Lagos, from memories of her father's accident that was never properly investigated, from questions she learned early not to ask. She came for distance, for safety, for a fresh start where her forensic accounting background could be used for something clean. But Kang Min-jun doesn't do clean. Why? The question escapes before she can stop it. Why bring someone in who could expose everything? He stops at the edge of her desk, close enough now that she can smell his cologne. Expensive, understated, controlled. Everything about him is controlled. Because exposure, Min-jun says quietly, his dark eyes holding hers, only matters if the person discovering it wants to expose. And you, Miss Adebola, don't strike me as someone interested in suicide. The threat hangs in the air, unspoken but absolute. So what happens now? Amara asks, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Now? Min-jun reaches across her desk, sliding a sealed black folder toward her with one finger. Now you open them up for me. Not the files this time. Something else. Something bigger. Her fingers tremble slightly as she reaches for the folder. Inside are documents she recognizes immediately, financial records, trade routes, shell corporations. But these aren't for analysis. They're for restructuring, for hiding, for making criminal enterprise look like legitimate business. She looks up slowly. Min-jun is watching her face, not her hands, studying her reaction the way a scientist studies a specimen. You want me to help you, she says. I want you to show me what you're capable of, he corrects. Your father refused to compromise. It cost him everything. His expression doesn't change, but something flickers in those dark eyes. I'm offering you a different choice. The words land like a blow. Your father. No one in Seoul knows about her father. No one should. You investigated me, Amara breathes. I investigate everyone I trust, Min-jun replies simply. And Miss Adebola. He leans forward slightly, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. I'm about to trust you with everything. Amara Adebola did not come to Seoul looking for danger. She came looking for distance. 3 continents away from Lagos, armed with a polished resume and a carefully neutral smile, she'd accepted a temporary contract at KMJ Holdings without asking the questions most people would ask. She didn't research the chairman's background, didn't investigate the whispers that followed the company name through business forums and expat groups, didn't let herself wonder why a multinational conglomerate needed a forensic accountant for what they claimed was routine executive assistance. Distance, she'd learned young, was the only reliable form of safety. Her father had taught her that lesson in reverse by refusing to create it. Adebayo Adebola had been a man of integrity in a profession where integrity was expensive. When powerful men asked him to open accounts that existed only on paper, to move money that carried the weight of blood, he'd said no. Politely, professionally, fatally. The official report called it a car accident. Brake failure on a rain-slick road. Amara knew better. She'd seen the books he'd been reviewing the week before he died. She'd watched men in expensive suits attend his funeral with expressions that looked like sympathy but felt like warning. So she'd learned to be different, to be useful without being compromised, to see without appearing to notice, to translate, organize, document, and disappear into pure efficiency. That was her gift. That was her armor. Seoul offered what Lagos couldn't. Anonymity in a city of 10 million people where she didn't speak the language fluently enough to make friends, where her dark skin marked her as foreign enough to be left alone, where she could rebuild herself into someone who asked no questions and expected nothing. KMJ Holdings seemed perfect. A massive corporate machine where she could be one replaceable cog among thousands. She hadn't counted on Kang Min-jun. The chairman of KMJ Holdings was not what she expected. There were no gold watches, no ostentatious displays of wealth, no raised voices or thrown objects like the volatile executives she'd worked for in London and Dubai. Min-jun was something far more unsettling. He was quiet. His authority didn't announce itself. It simply existed, absolute and unquestioned. Rooms adjusted when he entered, not because he demanded attention but because attention gravitated toward him instinctively. Men twice his size stood straighter without realizing it. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Even the air seemed to sharpen. Publicly, he was a reclusive corporate titan who rarely gave interviews and never attended social events. KMJ Holdings board meetings were legendary for their efficiency. Min-jun spoke for exactly as long as necessary, made decisions without deliberation, and left before small talk could begin. Privately, Seoul whispered a different name. Mafia. Amara had ignored the whispers. Whispers were currency in every city, traded by people who had nothing else of value. She focused instead on learning his patterns, anticipating his needs, becoming indispensable through competence alone. Black coffee, no sugar. Meetings scheduled in ruthless 30-minute blocks with no buffer time. Documents reviewed once. Mistakes were not forgiven twice. He never repeated himself, never explained his reasoning. Expected her to understand context from subtext, to read the spaces between his carefully chosen words. When he spoke to her, it was clipped, precise, transactional. The Singapore contract needs revision by noon. Reschedule the morning. Something came up. These numbers don't reconcile. Find out why. She executed flawlessly. She didn't ask what something came up meant when 3 executives were suddenly no longer with the company. Didn't question why certain files were hand-delivered by men who looked like they'd never seen the inside of an office. Didn't comment when Min-jun returned from business trips with shadows under his eyes that suggested business conducted in darkness. She did her job. Nothing more. That was the agreement. That was safe. Until the morning he'd slid that first sealed folder across his desk and said, with absolute calm, "Open them up for me." Now, standing in his office at midnight with that black folder in her hands, and the weight of his attention on her face, Amara understood what she'd missed. Kang Min-jun hadn't hired a secretary. He'd hired a successor, or a weapon, or something worse. And every moment of the last 3 months, every test, every impossible deadline, every document that revealed too much, had been an evaluation she hadn't known she was taking. The most dangerous man in Korea had been watching her. And she'd passed. The shift happened without announcement, the way all truly dangerous things did in Kang Min-jun's world. 1 week after that midnight conversation, Amara's access codes changed. Not revoked, expanded. Suddenly, documents that had previously gone directly to Min-jun's desk were rerouted through her system first. Contracts from Singapore, shipping manifests from Busan, financial reports from subsidiaries she hadn't known existed. She became the gatekeeper, the filter through which all information had to pass before reaching the chairman's hands. It should have felt like a promotion. Instead, it felt like a test with stakes she couldn't yet see. The executive floor noticed immediately. Senior vice presidents who'd barely acknowledged her existence now greeted her with careful politeness. The legal team started CCING her on correspondence marked confidential. Even Director Choi, a man who'd made his disdain for temporary foreign hires abundantly clear, began requesting her approval on budget allocations. Amara understood the message. Her value had been publicly established. Cross her and you crossed Kang Min-jun. She didn't let it go to her head. Power borrowed from proximity wasn't real power. It was a leash disguised as authority. One mistake, one moment of arrogance, and Min-jun would cut her loose without hesitation. So she worked harder, arrived earlier, left later, cross-referenced every number, verified every source, flagged every inconsistency. When the marketing department submitted a campaign budget with inflated figures, she rejected it with a 2-line email. When external auditors requested files that would have exposed irregularities in overseas accounts, she restructured the data presentation so thoroughly that the numbers told a completely different, completely legal story. She didn't do it to protect Min-jun. She did it because survival meant being indispensable. The late nights became routine. The city would glitter below the penthouse office while rain streaked the windows, and Amara would remove her heels beneath her desk, rub her aching arches, and continue working.
Min-jun noticed everything.
He always did. He began staying later too, not working, watching. He'd stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows with his hands in his pockets, silent, while she typed. Sometimes he'd bring her coffee without asking if she wanted it. Black, no sugar. The same way he took his. Felt like intimacy. Terrified her. One evening, 3 months into her new role, he placed a ledger on her desk without explanation. The pages were dense with transactions, layers of transfers between accounts that should never have intersected. "Tell me what you see," Min-jun said, his voice quiet in the empty office. Amara studied the numbers, her trained eye-catching patterns that would be invisible to anyone else. She traced one particular series of transfers, small amounts, frequent, systematic. "You're bleeding money intentionally," she said finally, not looking up. "These transfers look like operational losses, but they're too consistent, too measured." She tapped a column of figures. "Someone thinks you don't know." The silence stretched long enough that she finally raised her head. Min-jun was watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not surprise, something deeper, something almost like satisfaction. Then he smiled. Rare, restrained, dangerous. "Good," he said softly. "You see clearly." The praise shouldn't have mattered. She'd been praised by executives, professors, senior partners at accounting firms across 3 continents. But something about the way Min-jun said it, the weight behind those 3 words, made her pulse quicken. "Who's stealing from you?" she asked. "Director Choi." Min-jun's smile didn't fade. "He thinks I'm too distracted with expansion to notice. He's been siphoning funds for 8 months. "You've known for 8 months? I wanted to see how long his confidence would last." Min-jun moved to the window, his reflection ghostly against the Seoul skyline. "And I wanted to see if you'd catch it. Another test. Always another test. What happens now?" Amara asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Min-jun was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different quality. Not quite a request, not quite a command. "I need your time tomorrow evening," he said. "Not here. Somewhere else." Her stomach tightened. "For what?" He turned from the window, his dark eyes unreadable. "You'll see." The file arrived on her desk 3 days later. Red tab, which meant urgent. Black seal, which meant classified. Amara opened it in Min-jun's presence, as protocol required for top-tier documents. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second, her expression carefully neutral as the implications assembled themselves. A shipping contract. Port of Busan to Manila. Pharmaceuticals listed as the cargo. Except the licensing numbers didn't match any legitimate pharmaceutical company. The routing included 2 extra stops that served no logistical purpose. And the insurance policy was 14 times higher than the declared value. She looked up slowly. Min-jun stood at his usual place by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the city below. "This deal," Amara said carefully, "will expose you. Not immediately." His tone was conversational.
No.
"Not immediately." She closed the folder. "But eventually, within 18 months, maybe less, someone will audit this route. The insurance alone will trigger questions. That's a long time in my business." "It's not long enough." Amara stood, crossing to his desk to place the folder down with deliberate precision. "I won't sign off on it." The silence that followed was absolute. Min-jun turned from the window slowly, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I said no." Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "This is reckless, and I won't attach my authorization to something that will eventually collapse." "You seem to be under a misunderstanding, Miss Adebola." Min-jun moved away from the window, each step measured, controlled. "I didn't ask for your permission. I asked for your signature. Then you elevated the wrong person." He stopped. Something flickered across his face. Not anger exactly, but something sharper, more dangerous. "Excuse me?" Amara held her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to step back as he approached. "You gave me authority over financial approvals. You made me the filter. That means when I see a deal that will expose your entire operation to international investigation, I have the authority and the responsibility to refuse it."
Min-jun stepped closer.
Too close. The air between them tightened, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the document on the desk and everything to do with power being challenged for the first time. "You forget your place," he said softly, his voice dropping to something dangerously quiet.
No.
Amara forced herself to meet his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes that had intimidated executives twice her size. "You elevated it." For a long, excruciating moment, he simply stared at her. The office felt smaller. The space between them felt like a battlefield. No one said no to Kang Min-jun. Ever. She was breaking an unspoken rule, violating the fundamental dynamic that kept his world spinning. People obeyed. People agreed. People survived by saying yes. Then something extraordinary happened. He laughed. Not loud, just a low, controlled sound that held genuine surprise. Maybe even respect. "You have courage," Min-jun said, his gaze still locked on hers. "Or you're suicidal. I haven't decided which."
I'm practical, Amara corrected.
"You didn't hire me to be a rubber stamp. You hired me because I see what others miss. Well, I see this, and it's a mistake." The tension held for another beat. Then Min-jun stepped back, creating space between them again. He moved to his desk, opened a drawer, and extracted a different file. Dark blue this time. He held it out to her. "Then show me a better way," he said quietly. Amara took the file with hands that no longer trembled. Inside were the same contracts, the same routes, but unmarked, unfinalized, waiting for restructuring. "You already had this prepared," she said slowly. "I had 2 versions," Min-jun admitted. "The reckless one was a test. Another test. Always another test. But this time, the test wasn't about obedience. It was about something else entirely: conviction, integrity, the willingness to challenge power when power was wrong. You wanted me to say no, Amara realized. I wanted to see if you would. Min-jun leaned against his desk, his expression still unreadable but somehow less guarded. Everyone else in this building would have signed without reading. They trust my judgment over their own. That kind of loyalty is useful, but it's not intelligence. And if I'd signed, then I would have known you were more interested in pleasing me than protecting what I've built. His voice carried weight now, real weight. I don't need more followers, Miss Adebola. I need someone who will tell me when I'm wrong. The implication settled over her like a cloak she hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. The rules had changed. She was no longer just his filter. She was his conscience. And that, Amara understood with sudden clarity, was far more dangerous than anything she'd signed up for. The summons came at 11:34 p.m., delivered via a text message so brief it felt like a command dressed as courtesy. My residence. Now, Amara stared at her phone screen in the back of the company car Min-jun had sent, watching Seoul's nighttime traffic blur past her window. She'd been home for less than an hour. Barely enough time to change out of her office clothes and into something resembling comfort before her phone had buzzed. The driver said nothing as they ascended into Gangnam's most exclusive district, where buildings competed for height and privacy cost more than most people's mortgages. They stopped at a high-rise that didn't advertise itself, no gold lettering or ostentatious displays. Just dark glass and angular architecture that suggested wealth so secure it didn't need to announce itself. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor. Amara stepped out of the private elevator into a space that redefined luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of Seoul's glittering sprawl. The interior was minimalist, all clean lines, dark wood, and strategic lighting that made the city outside feel like it existed for his viewing pleasure alone. Min-jun stood at the far window, still in his suit despite the late hour, a glass of amber liquid in one hand. You came quickly, he observed without turning. You didn't phrase it as optional. He turned then, and something in his expression looked different outside the office. Less guarded, more human. Drink. He gestured to a bar cart that probably cost more than her yearly salary.
No.
Amara stayed near the elevator, instinctively maintaining distance. Why am I here? Min-jun studied her for a moment, then set his glass down with careful precision. Because what I'm about to offer you can't be discussed in an office where walls have ears. Her stomach tightened.
I'm listening.
I need you closer, he said simply. Officially. I already work for you. Not like this. Min-jun moved to a sleek desk, extracting a bound document. He placed it on the glass coffee table between them. Expanded authority. Access to accounts currently restricted to myself and two others. Decision-making power over international operations. Your signature carrying the same weight as mine. Amara approached slowly, picking up the document. The terms were laid out in precise legal language, a position that didn't technically exist in KMJ Holdings' corporate structure. No title, just authority and protection. Page 7, Min-jun said quietly. She flipped to it. There, in dense legal text, was a clause that made her blood run cold. Any action taken against the signatory will be interpreted as action taken against the principal and responded to accordingly. You're making me untouchable, she said slowly. By anyone except me, Min-jun clarified. Once you sign this, your name becomes visible. Seoul's underworld will know you have my authority. My competitors will know. My enemies will know. He paused. You'll be protected, but you'll also be a target. And if I say no, then nothing changes. You remain my executive secretary. Comfortable. Safe. His dark eyes held hers. But we both know you didn't come to Seoul looking for safety. The words landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Amara set the document down, her mind racing. This wasn't a promotion, it was an initiation. A door that only opened one way. Why me? She asked. You have people who've been loyal for years. People who understand this world better than I do. Loyalty built on fear is fragile. Min-jun replied. And people who understand this world too well stop seeing the traps. He moved closer, his presence filling the space between them. You see clearly because you're not corrupted by familiarity. You challenge me because you're not afraid of the consequences. And you're exhausted, Miss Adebola. She tensed. Excuse me? Exhausted from living carefully, from measuring every word, every action, every risk. His voice dropped lower. You came to Seoul to disappear, but disappearing isn't the same as living. You want agency. You want your choices to matter. The observation cut too close. Amara had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility, blending into corporate structures, never standing out, never taking risks that couldn't be calculated. It had kept her safe. It had also made her small. Once I sign this, she said quietly, I can't walk away.
No.
I become part of your world, your empire, whatever you're building. Yes. And if I refuse? Min-jun's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Not threat, something else. Something almost like disappointment. Then you remain exactly who you've been, he said. Efficient, invisible, safe. The word safe sounded like an insult. Amara looked down at the document again, at the clauses that would change everything. Her name on contracts that moved millions. Her signature authorizing decisions that affected lives. Her presence announced to a world she'd spent years hiding from. It was terrifying. It was also intoxicating. I'll consider it, she said finally. Min-jun's lips curved into that rare, restrained smile. No, Miss Adebola, he said softly. You already have. And the terrifying part was he was right. The first sign came at 6:47 a.m. Amara's security badge, which had previously granted access to the executive floor and archives, now opened every door in the building. When she stepped into the private elevator reserved for C-suite executives, it didn't require additional authorization. It simply accepted her presence as valid. The second sign came at 8:15 a.m., when she arrived at her desk to find it wasn't her desk anymore. Her belongings had been moved overnight to an office 3 doors down from Min-jun's. Glass walls, city views, furniture that whispered quiet intimidation. A nameplate sat on the door, brushed steel with stark black lettering. Adebola Amara, Strategic Operations. No title, just a name and 2 words that meant everything and nothing. By 9 a.m., the entire building knew. Director Choi, who'd been siphoning funds for 8 months, was escorted out by security. No explanation given.
No dramatic confrontation.
He simply ceased to exist within KMJ Holdings' ecosystem, his office cleaned out by 10 a.m. as if he'd never been there at all. The message was clear: cross her, and you cross Kang Min-jun. The response was immediate. Senior executives who'd barely acknowledged her existence now stopped by her office with transparent excuses. Budget questions that didn't need asking, contract clarifications that were already clear. They were performing deference, establishing rapport, making sure she knew they respected her authority. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like exposure. By noon, Amara noticed the fear. The way junior staff averted their eyes when she passed in hallways. The way conversations stopped when she entered the break room. The way people smiled too quickly, agreed too readily, laughed at comments that weren't jokes. They didn't see her anymore. They saw him, his authority, his ruthlessness, his capacity for consequence, reflected through her. She'd become the extension of a man whose name people only whispered. The realization settled over her during lunch, which she took alone in her new office, staring at Seoul sprawl and wondering what exactly she'd signed away. Her phone buzzed. A message from Min-jun, characteristically brief. Conference room. Now, she found him standing at the head of the table, tablet in hand, reviewing something that made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Around the table sat the heads of international operations: Singapore, Manila, Tokyo, Hong Kong. All of them men who'd been running their territories longer than Amara had been in Seoul. All of them straightened slightly when she entered. Miss Adebola, Min-jun said without preamble. Walk us through the Manila restructuring. It wasn't a request. For the next 40 minutes, She presented the alternative routing she'd developed, the one that accomplished Min-jun's goals without the exposure risks of his original plan. She spoke clearly, precisely, answering challenges from executives who were testing her competence, her authority, her right to be in that room. Min-jun said nothing, just watched. When she finished, the room was silent for 3 beats too long. Then the Singapore director nodded slowly. It works. One by one, the others agreed. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. Her plan was better, and in Min-jun's world, competence was the only currency that mattered. As the meeting dispersed, Amara remained, gathering her materials. The others filed out with carefully neutral expressions, already adjusting to the new hierarchy.
Only Min-jun stayed.
You handled them well, he said once the door closed. They hate me. They respect you. Hate comes later. Min-jun approached, his expression unreadable. How does it feel? Amara met his gaze. Terrifying. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. He paused, then added quietly, You're doing what I need you to do. The words should have pleased her. Instead, they highlighted something she'd been trying not to examine too closely, the way Min-jun watched her now. Not as an employee, not even as an asset, as something closer to a partner, an equal, which meant she had something he'd never had before, the ability to leave him exposed. I have another international call tonight, Min-jun continued, his tone shifting into something less formal. Tokyo, midnight our time. Send me the briefing materials.
No.
He cut her off gently. I don't need you for the call. I need you there. Amara frowned. I don't understand. Min-jun was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Neither do I, he admitted finally. But I'm asking anyway. The vulnerability in those words, so small, so carefully controlled, was more unsettling than any command he could have given. He wasn't asking for her work. He was asking for her presence. And somehow that changed everything. The Tokyo call lasted 47 minutes. Amara sat across from Min-jun's desk, tablet open, monitoring the contract terms being discussed in rapid Japanese that she only partially understood. Her role wasn't to translate. Min-jun's Japanese was flawless. Her role was simply to be there. She watched him negotiate with the precision of a surgeon, his voice never rising, his terms non-negotiable but delivered with such calm certainty that the men on the other end agreed without realizing they'd been backed into corners. When the call ended, Min-jun set his phone down and leaned back in his chair, a rare moment of visible fatigue crossing his features. Your assessment? He asked. They'll agree to your terms, Amara replied, but they'll resent it. Give it 6 months before they try to renegotiate. 4 months, Min-jun corrected. Nakamura doesn't have the patience for 6. He studied her for a moment. You read people well. I read patterns. People are just patterns with egos attached. Something flickered in his expression. Amusement, maybe, or recognition. Stay. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a command either. Amara glanced at her watch.
12:47 a.m.
It's late. I know what time it is. Min-jun stood, moving to the bar cart and pouring 2 glasses of whiskey without asking if she wanted one. He placed one in front of her. Humor me. She should have left. Should have maintained the boundaries that were already dissolving too quickly. Instead, she accepted the glass and took a careful sip. Expensive. Smooth. The kind of liquor that didn't burn but warned. Why did you really need me on that call? She asked. Min-jun returned to his chair, cradling his own glass. For a long moment he didn't answer, just watched the amber liquid catch the light. You have a way of seeing things I miss, he said finally. Not because I'm not observant, but because I'm too close, too familiar with the patterns. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. You provide clarity. You managed perfectly well before I arrived. Did I? Min-jun's tone was genuinely curious. Or did I simply not know what I was missing? The words hung between them, weighted with implications neither of them was ready to examine directly. Over the following weeks, the pattern intensified. Min-jun began requesting her presence at meetings where her expertise wasn't technically necessary. Strategy sessions where he already knew the answers but asked for her opinion anyway. Late-night reviews of contracts that could have waited until morning. "What do you think?" became his most frequent question. He started changing decisions based on her input, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. When she suggested restructuring the Singapore operations to reduce exposure, he implemented it within 48 hours. When she questioned a partnership with a Manila distributor whose financials looked too clean, he canceled the deal without explanation. His empire was shifting, reshaping itself around her judgment. It should have felt like power. Instead, it felt like quicksand. One evening, 3 weeks after her promotion became official, Amara found herself in his office at 2 a.m., reviewing quarterly projections that had already been approved by every relevant department. "Why are we doing this?" she asked finally, exhaustion making her blunt. "These numbers are fine. You don't need me to verify what 6 other people have already confirmed." Min-jun looked up from his own tablet, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain. "No," he agreed quietly. "I don't." "Then why?" "Because I think more clearly when you're here," he interrupted, the admission seeming to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "Your presence changes how I process information, how I evaluate risks." He paused. "It's not rational, but it's true." Amara's breath caught. This wasn't about her competence anymore. This was about something far more dangerous, dependence. "Min-jun." She used his first name without thinking, and he noticed, his expression sharpening slightly. "You're one of the most capable men I've ever met. You don't need me to." "I didn't," he said simply. "Before you, I didn't. Now I do." The confession landed like a weight. She understood then what was happening. Kang Min-jun, who ruled through control, who eliminated weakness, who made himself invulnerable through calculated isolation, had allowed her inside his process, inside his thinking, inside the machinery of how he made decisions. And now that machinery didn't function the same way without her. "That's dangerous," Amara said softly. "Yes. If I leave, you won't." Not a threat. A statement of fact, delivered with absolute certainty. But as she sat there in the early morning silence, watching this powerful man acknowledge a vulnerability he'd never shown anyone else, Amara realized the truth was more complicated. The question wasn't whether she would leave. The question was whether Kang Min-jun could still rule his empire if she did. And neither of them knew the answer. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Amara was reviewing acquisition documents when her tablet pinged with an alert she'd set up weeks ago. A financial anomaly buried 3 layers deep in KMJ Holdings' European subsidiaries. Money moving in patterns that shouldn't exist. Transfers that created exposure. She recognized the signature immediately. Min-jun's work. A deal he'd approved without consulting her. She found him in his office, standing at his usual place by the window, Seoul's afternoon light casting sharp angles across his face. "The Berlin acquisition," she said without preamble, placing her tablet on his desk. "You approved it this morning." "Yes." He didn't turn around. "Without discussing it with me. I'm still capable of making decisions independently, Miss Adebola." The formal address stung more than it should have. "This deal exposes you to the same risks we restructured out of Manila," Amara continued, keeping her voice level. "Same vulnerability, different location. Why would you?" "Because I needed to know if I could." Now he turned, and the expression on his face was one she'd never seen before. Something raw beneath his usual control. "If I could what?" she asked carefully. "Make a decision without asking for your opinion first." Min-jun moved away from the window, but didn't approach her. Maintained distance, as if proximity would reveal too much. "Do you know how many decisions I made today?" "I don't." 43. 43 separate decisions requiring my approval or authorization. His voice remained quiet, controlled, but something underneath was fraying. "Do you know how many times I thought about asking you first?" Amara's throat tightened.
Min-jun.
"All of them." He finally closed the distance between them, stopping just short of where professionalism ended. Every single decision, I wanted your assessment, your insight, your presence. He paused. So I forced myself to make one without you, to prove I still could. And I made a mistake. The admission seemed to cost him. The Berlin deal has the same structural flaws you would have caught in 30 seconds. I saw them 3 hours later, after it was already approved. Amara stared at him, understanding crystallizing with terrifying clarity. This wasn't about competence anymore. It wasn't about her value as an asset or her skill as an analyst. This was about Kang Min-jun, the most dangerous man in Seoul, a man who'd built an empire on control and isolation, discovering that he'd accidentally made himself vulnerable. To her, "You're not angry that I questioned you," she said slowly. "You're angry that you need me to." "I don't get angry," Min-jun corrected. "I get strategic." "Then what is this?" For a long moment he didn't answer, just looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes that suddenly seemed far less unreadable than before. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "That's the problem." Amara felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a physical thing. She'd spent months learning to navigate Min-jun's world, his rhythms, his tests, his carefully constructed empire. But this was different. This was him admitting she'd become load-bearing. "I should leave," she said quietly. Not a decision, just a statement of fact. "Yes." His agreement was immediate. "For both our sakes you should." "But I won't."
No.
Something flickered in his expression. Relief, maybe, or resignation. "You won't." The truth hung between them. She'd become too valuable to lose, and he'd become too dependent to let her go. It was the most dangerous kind of partnership, one built not on equals, but on mutual necessity that neither could afford to acknowledge fully. "So what happens now?" Amara asked. Min-jun was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving hers. "We find out," he said finally, "whether I'm strong enough to share control or whether you're foolish enough to let me." That night, Amara stood in her own apartment for the first time in days, staring at Seoul's glittering sprawl through windows that suddenly felt too small, too isolated. Her phone buzzed. A message from Min-jun, sent at 11:47 p.m. "Tomorrow. Early meeting with Hong Kong. I need your assessment on their proposal. Not I need you for the meeting. Not I need your presence. I need your assessment." A careful retreat into professionalism. An attempt to rebuild boundaries that had dissolved too completely. But they both knew the truth now. She replied simply, "I'll be there." Across the city, in a penthouse that commanded Seoul's skyline, Kang Min-jun stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. For the first time in 15 years of building an empire through calculated isolation, he was uncertain. Not about business, not about strategy, about whether he'd made his greatest asset or his greatest weakness. Because Amara Adebola had done something no one else had ever managed. She'd made herself indispensable not through fear or loyalty, but through the simple, terrifying act of seeing him clearly. And now the question wasn't whether she belonged in his world. The question was whether his world could survive without her. He didn't know the answer, and that, more than any business risk or territorial threat, was the most dangerous position Kang Min-jun had ever found himself in. But some endings are just beginnings wearing different faces. And in Seoul, where power and vulnerability dance on knife edges, Amara Adebola and Kang Min-jun were about to discover that the most dangerous territory wasn't his empire. It was the space between control and surrender. What happens next? The choice is no longer just theirs to make. If you enjoyed the story this far, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter and enjoy more story from us. And if this story gave you chills, drop a like and share it with someone who loves powerful romance with a dangerous edge. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thank you.